Well, good morning. Happy Monday. Where did that weekend go? That one didn't last too long, did it, Shannon? It seemed like we were just here. Not to you. You had a good long weekend, huh? So I had a good weekend too. It just went by. It went by way too fast. And there's obviously a lot to talk about today with the passing of President George Herbert Walker Bush, and we're going to spend a lot of show on that, including talking to people who knew him. But I do want to mention, just after the show on Friday, there were a couple of big, or at least fairly large, earthquakes in Alaska. Did you see that? It was kind of crazy, but it got pushed out of the news rather quickly. But there's still some aftershocks going on. I see Daily Express, which is a British paper, but headline: 1,000 aftershocks hit Anchorage since Friday. It's pretty crazy. And, of course, it's winter in Alaska, which is not the optimal time to have an earthquake if there were going to be one. Winter in Alaska is probably not it. But anyway, I hope they're okay up there. In a lot of ways, it actually seemed like the damage was less than they feared it might be, given a 7.0 earthquake pretty close to the city of Anchorage, which has 280,000 people in it. All right, so we'll see if anything new happens there. We'll keep you posted on that. So on Friday, we told you during the show, I was going to be going over, and did go over, to the Not So Silent Night concert, the KTCL thing, and producer Shannon was there with his daughter, and I was there with my kids, and it was a pretty good show. I felt a little bad in a way for the bands because there were a lot of empty seats for whatever reason, but we enjoyed it a lot. But the problem for me was the band I wanted to see the most was the Revivalists, although I really want to see American Authors a lot too. Got to see them. But then before we got to the Revivalists, Jasper fell asleep. And Lily leaned over and said to me, "Dad, I'm really tired." And what I had done, just to give my wife a night of peace and quiet, we actually went up and booked a room for the night at that Omni Interlaken Hotel, which is pretty close to the First Bank Center in Broomfield. And they have it seems like every time I stay at that Omni Interlaken, it's snowing. But their outdoor pool is really nice and heated. It's nice to go in when it's cold out. So we took the kids, and Kristen stayed home with the dog, and the kids and I went to the show and then went and stayed at the hotel. And it was lovely. I'm told by Kristen that she was home watching a TV show and couldn't find Reuben, our little black French bulldog, and eventually found him lying on my bed, our bed. He was on my side of the bed with his head on my pillow, as if he was replacing me. Like, Dad has moved out with the kids. Here I am to replace your husband, right here, lying in your husband's spot with your head on your husband's pillow. And Kristen let him stay there. So Kristen had a different man into bed for the evening, a small black French bulldog with his head on my pillow. But I guess when the cat's away, or something, when the husband's away. All right, let's talk a little bit about what's going on today with George H.W. Bush. Actually, let's start with just 16 seconds of sound.
I think character matters a lot. I think you have to have a moral compass. Doesn't mean you have to have a pristine personal life. I never liked all these intrusions and stuff, but patriotic values, sense of service, those things mean something to me.
That was George H.W. Bush in 1996 doing an interview with Paul Lazan, I think it was, on ABC. And I've got some more of that. We've got a lot of audio from not just George H.W. Bush, but from his sons and his friends. And, of course, you really can't get through any conversation of George W. Bush without a little bit of Dana Carvey, right?
Hurricane Hugo doing that damage down there, going round and round, doing that hurricane thing down there. A lot of damage. Natural disaster, not my fault. Spending relief, sending it down there, not too much, not too quickly. Wouldn't be prudent at this juncture.
That's actually what made Dana Carvey a big star, was his impression of George H.W. Bush. And later I actually have some sound for you of when Dana Carvey was invited to the White House near the very end of the Bush presidency. Yeah, and in 1992, it was December of 1992, right? So he would have lost his re-election already. He invited Dana Carvey to the White House, and Dana did some Bush impressions and some Ross Perot, and it was really something. You know, if you I posted this to the blog. It's worth going to check out. If you go to rosskaminsky.com, you can see it, because especially toward the end of this, you can see when Dana Carvey kind of invites the president to come up on the stage, and Barbara Bush walks up there, and Dana Carvey's wife walks up there, and George H.W. Bush walks up, and you can just see in Dana Carvey's voice and demeanor and behavior that he is standing there in awe of the presidency. And really, even though he's up there telling jokes and doing impressions, you can tell that he knows it is a very special place to be and a special moment in his life, and something that so few people ever get to experience. And it's really worth checking out, and I put it up on the blog so you can find it easily if you go to rosskaminsky.com. So we'll talk a little more in a moment about the life of George H.W. Bush, but I wanted to just give you a couple of other pieces of information. So today, the plane that is called Air Force One, it's actually technically only Air Force One when the president is on it, but anyway, that plane, they are removing some seats from it. Did you not know that, Shannon? I don't know what it will be designated today. That's a good question. I think you've just assigned yourself some homework. That's what you get for asking questions during the show. But it is actually only called Air Force One when the president is on the plane. But they are removing some seats from the plane at President Trump's order to make room for George H.W. Bush's casket. And that airplane will bring the casket to Washington, D.C. today. And President Bush will lay in state at the Capitol until Wednesday. There will be a ceremony in the National Cathedral on Wednesday, starting at 9 o'clock our time, 11 o'clock Eastern. President Trump will attend. Wednesday will also be declared a national day of mourning in dedication to George H.W. Bush. I assume that every living former president and current president will be there. Michelle Obama is going to be there. I know most of you don't care whether Michelle Obama will be there. The interesting part of that is she actually had some tour dates for her book tour in Paris and somewhere in Germany, I think. I don't remember for sure, but she's canceling those to come back to be at the funeral. And then there will be a second memorial service at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, which is where he went to church most Sundays, in Houston at 11 a.m. Eastern, again, 9 a.m. our time on Thursday. And then George H.W. Bush will be buried at his own presidential library and museum at Texas A&M University, where his late wife, Barbara, as well as their daughter, Robin, who died at the age of 3 from leukemia back in the 1950s, are also buried. So that's the plan. That's the plan. I'll tell you, so the part of the reason I actually started the show by mentioning the concert that I took my kids to was when we got back to the hotel room, we saw the story that night that he had passed away, and then we watched, more cable news in the morning and people who knew George H.W. Bush speaking about him. And, of course, the people who knew Bush best were the people who knew Bush best, and everybody knows who those people are, and they made the rounds through the various TV shows, including, of course, Jim Bakker, George W. Bush's closest friend, best friend, other George H.W. Bush. Sorry if I make that mistake during the show a time or two. But other than Barbara Bush, H.W.'s best friend was James Baker. And I wanted to share with you over the course of the show some sound from Baker talking about, well, various parts of their relationship. But he was also asked about H.W.'s last day. Maybe I should call him Bush 41, about 41's last day.
That last day was really a very, very gentle and peaceful passing for him. He had not gotten out of bed for 3 or 4 days. I lived close by his home here in Houston, and I went over there at 7:15 on Friday morning, expecting to see him sleeping, but he was alert, more alert than he'd been in 4 or 5 days. And I sat there, had a wonderful 2-hour visit, just the two of us. He ate a big breakfast, ate 3 eggs and yogurt and 2 fruit drinks and everything. He hadn't been eating much. And he was really, and we all began to think, well, here we are. He's going to surprise us again. It's another bounce back day. We went over there again later in the evening. My wife and I were going out to dinner around 6 o'clock, and he was not in quite as good shape. We went out to dinner, and on our way home, they called us and said, "You better come on over." And we went there, got there about 8:15, and he passed away at 10:10.
Now, one of the best stories of the evening, to the extent that you can talk about a good story in someone passing, was Bush 41's last words.
When I showed up at 7 o'clock in the morning, one of the aides who assisted him physically said, "Mr. President, Secretary Baker's here." And he opened both eyes. He looked at me. He said, "Hey, Bake, where are we going today?" And I said, "Well, Heffy," I said, "we're going to heaven." He said, "Good, that's where I want to go." Little did I know, or did he know, of course, that by 10 o'clock that night he'd be in heaven.
And actually, let me clarify. Those weren't his last words. Those were some of his last words. The story of his actual last words.
Well, then later on, as it became obvious that he was probably going to pass that evening, they got all the kids on the phone. You know, when somebody's passing away, the last sense that goes is the hearing, and they can hear things. So they got the kids on the phone, and each one of them spoke to him, and he spoke back or mumbled back anyway. And then they got 43 on the phone, and 43 said, "I love you, Dad, and I just want to, and I'll see you in heaven." And 41 said, "I love you too." And those were the last words that he ever spoke.
His last words telling his son, who was also President of the United States, George W. Bush, "I love you." So it was actually, I heard him tell that story. I heard Baker tell that story a couple of times yesterday because I watched a couple of the Sunday shows, and the whole thing brings a tear to your eye. George H.W. Bush was a remarkable guy. I mean, this is a guy who apparently lied about his age to join the Navy, waiting to go to Yale, of all places, but instead he lied about his age, became one of the youngest, if not the youngest, fighter pilots in the Navy, was shot down, was rescued, fortunately for him, by an American submarine. If the Japanese had gotten him, I'm sure we'd have a whole different story, or lack of any major story, about George H.W. Bush. Producer Shannon, by the way, has found out that when the plane that is usually called Air Force One goes to get George H.W. Bush's casket, since it's only Air Force One, when the president is on it, it will be called Special Air Mission 41, SAM-41, Special Air Mission 41, in honor of George H.W. Bush being the 41st president. There's a really good piece over at NPR's website that talks about, well, that the headline is, "What We All Forget If We Ever Knew About the Political Career of Bush 41. And there's a lot more to this man than politics, but of course that's what he's famous for. And I thought you'd find some of this interesting. First of all, many Americans have long forgotten that Bush actually first ran for president way back in 1980, and he actually won Iowa. He actually won Iowa over a field of better-known current and former office holders, including Ronald Reagan. Then they went up, I think it was in New Hampshire, where they had a debate where Reagan had that famous line, you know, I paid for this microphone, right? And that was kind of the end of Bush for that particular round. But he'd been involved in politics and running for office for a very, very long time. His dad was a senator. Prescott Bush was a senator from Connecticut. And if you think about Bush 41, I mean, boy, did he have the story, right? I mean, legitimate war hero, Yale, captained the Yale baseball team, of all things, moves to Texas, becomes a self-made millionaire in the oil business. I mean, he was all of that. Plus, if you look at his, especially when you think about running for president, you think about his resume before that, I'd argue that Bush was perhaps the single most qualified person ever to be elected president of the United States, if you think about it. He had been something like ambassador to China. I say something like because we didn't have formal relationship with China at that time, so it was more of a council kind of thing, not exactly ambassador, but we'll call it ambassador to China. He was also our ambassador to the United Nations. He also ran the CIA. He had also been in Congress. He had also been vice president under Ronald Reagan for 8 years. I mean, if there's anybody who was ready to be president of the United States, it was George Herbert Walker Bush. One man who knew him and deeply respected him was Michael Morrell, former acting director of the CIA. Mike Morrell joins us next.
This report is sponsored by Little Passports.
I have to drive in the building mode for your Monday morning in 25 southbound, a little sluggish as you